Henry II of England and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, have created and ruled the Plantagenet Empire, the most dynamic, wealthiest, and most powerful kingdom in Western Europe. But the Plantagenets are rarely at peace, and Henry's temper and ego has long troubled his family and his people, from the shocking martyrdom of Thomas Becket to the vicious Great Rebellion that saw Eleanor sent to prison for 15 years. Meanwhile, their brilliant, avaricious, rebellious children have grown, fought, ruled, married, and even died, so that of his 5 sons, only 2 survive, Richard Lionheart and John Lackland. Now, as the 12th century enters its final decade, Henry himself dies, leaving his great legacy poised at the edge of great success or great failure. Here's the story of what happens as Richard and John take their turns on the Plantagenet throne.
Welcome back to Season 3 of Lion's Forge. My name is Beckett, and I want to tell you a story. An epic true story of 5 kings and the Lion Queen. Season 3, Episode 13, A King's Ransom. Lionheart's imprisonment had an immediately galvanizing effect on 2 men who had not shared in his capture, John Lackland and Philip Augustus. The entire time Richard had been away, Brother John had never stopped broadcasting his opinion that Richard very well might never return. Word that he had been captured by the Germans only increased Lackland's glee at his brother's fate, which now seemed likely to consist of a shrunken, powerless lifetime of captivity 1,000 miles away. During the year Richard spent gazing at German skies, John had quite a time. Proclaiming himself king to anyone who would listen, he took a fast boat to France, where he transformed disloyalty into treason by doing homage to Philip Augustus for the entirety of the Plantagenet Empire. He said he'd marry neglected former Lionheart fiancée Elise, an interesting prospect since he was already married. He said the French could have Gisors and the Vexin, which weren't his to give. Philip was so energized in turn that he snapped up several Norman castles before besieging Rouen, one of Normandy's most important cities, while happily weighing the fun that might be had by invading England. A few resistors stood up to the gale. The strongest of them all was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Not only was she an experienced hand at the tiller of government, but, as mother to both Richard and John, she possessed a power over both unique in the world. Even though she was cresting her 70s, she wasn't about to sit quietly in a placid garden at Fontevraud while civil war threatened an empire she'd helped create, and her beloved Richard endured imprisonment, a privation she understood in her very bones. The old lady promptly raised an army and chased her youngest son into Wallingford, off to the northwest of London, and then busied herself with negotiations regarding her most beloved child's departure from the Emperor's prisons. We still have a letter from Richard thanking her for her determined work on his behalf. Another, perhaps surprising stalwart was William the Lion of Scotland, who rebuffed the offer of an alliance with the French. For both Duke Leopold of Austria and the German Emperor Henry, capturing Richard was rather like stumbling into a diamond mine, and Henry in particular could use the money. He had rebels to fight everywhere he looked, which meant armies to pay and loyal vassals to reward. Everyone in Europe understood that Richard would have to be ransomed, and magnificently so. Yet no matter how aggressive mental calculations of the number may have been, speculation stopped dead when the actual terms of Richard's release came out. The Emperor wanted nothing less than 100,000 silver marks, topped off by Richard's homage, the release of Isaac Comnenus and his daughter, Assorted sureties in the form of more hostages from the Plantagenet nobility, Richard's commitment of ships and knights to support Henry's next assault on Sicily, and, yanking the chain just a bit harder, Richard's personal attendance upon that campaign at his own expense. There were also deadlines to be met, with half the total due the following autumn and the other half by the February after that. Failure in any regard meant that Richard would go back to Leopold. One does wonder if Lionheart in turn thought of an August day not too long past when he had been the one waiting for another ruler to hit the right marks on the calendar with caravans of gold. The money itself wasn't entirely unprecedented. Richard had demanded far more from Saladin to release the hostages taken when Anchor fell, but that sum covered more than 2,000 captives. For one individual, this king's ransom was on a scale that made a man suck in his breath when he heard of it. Historians differ as to how much 100,000 pieces of silver in the 1190s would be worth today, but no one thinks it was petty. Frank McLynn puts it at better than $2.5 billion. Everyone agrees it certainly represented a towering percentage of all Plantagenet income at the time. Henry of Germany may not have planned on bankrupting the Plantagenets, but he looked to have made a good start at doing just that. Every bit of that fantastic sum would come from the same source as all other money destined for royalty: Richard's subjects. Word flooded Europe that the Normans, the Angevins, the Aquitanians, the Scots, the Irish, the Bretons, and the English would have to raise this staggering fortune to free their hostage king. In the words of chronicler Peter of Blois, the devil-ridden Germans were levying a treasure that would be sucked from, quote, the pitiful substance of the poor, the tears of widows, the pittance of monks and nuns, the dowries of maidens, the substance of scholars. Eleanor, mindful of 15 years of her own life spent under guard, was in the thick of it. The lady was at the very center of the immense effort to get Richard home. She hired messengers and tacksmen for every town, every county, every province in the Plantagenet world to funnel silver into the vaults of London's Cathedral of St. Paul. She was 70 years old by now, but no matter. The chronicler Richard of Devizes still found her unwearied by any task, provoking wonder at her stamina. The well-off were taxed a quarter of their income for Anno Domini 1193, and the truly rich were expected to pay not only their assessed share, but to volunteer to pay even more. Churches handed over priceless objects gifted to grace altars in better days. Abbeys turned over their wool and wheat. Everyone faced new taxes on personal belongings, from pewter candlesticks to cattle. There were new fines for having made the mistake of supporting John Lackland. Extra taxes were imposed on Jews. More modest souls could pay less, but everyone was expected to pay something. One chronicler summed it up by writing, "No one could say, 'Behold, I am only so-and-so. Pray, let me be excused.' Bishops carrying golden chalices, peasants with sacks of rye, landowners, merchants, knights holding prized family jewels, nobles tossing coins on the table, everyone subject to Richard paid. Just a few years ago, they had been financially stripped to send Richard on crusade. Now, they were being taxed even more to bring him back. An uglier reality, given the times, was that hostages were demanded as security for full payment. The despised former Chancellor Longchamp was called back from exile to deal with this unpleasantness, which required rounding up bishops, barons, and notable heirs to the great estates, including children, to be led off to Germany and left there until the ransom was fully paid. The widespread anguish over this prospect pressed everyone to even more frantic efforts to raise the money. Parents much preferred sending silver coins and family jewels instead of firstborn sons and marriageable daughters. Reality thus intruded upon what had been John's fevered dream of becoming king. The arrival of the emperor's ransom demand meant that Richard could be coming home after all. There's a story that Lackland conceived a plot to keep the taxman from collecting his brother's intended ransom by forging official seals so he could pilfer funds intended for the ransom coffers. It didn't work. The rivers of money destined for Germany couldn't be diverted. Given that it would take time for even the Plantagenet world to find, collect, and transport 30 tons of silver, Richard would have to wait it out. But Longchamp, in addition to his unhappy role as hostage-taker, dealt directly with the ransomers to negotiate the terms of Richard's captivity. He made a good job of it. Lionheart was granted considerable freedom of movement, and the Germans agreed that once the first 70,000 silver pieces were delivered, Richard would be free to leave altogether. Thus, after the first few slow months, which included a thankfully brief stay in forbidding Trafal's castle, he moved in tandem with the imperial court, spending most of his time in the sophisticated comfort of Speyer, where Bernard of Clairvaux had won over the Germans at the beginning of the Second Crusade, or the ancient city of Worms, already well into its second millennium when Richard was there. This happy outcome also owed something to growing warmth between the emperor and the Plantagenet king. There was a nasty crisis brewing in Henry's country over the death of a ranking German bishop, a crime that echoed Canterbury a quarter-century before. There had been a violent argument over who should be the Bishop of Liege, the Church's choice or the Emperor's. The winner, who was not Henry's preferred candidate, was soon after murdered by 3 German knights, and it was widely believed that the Emperor was behind the bishop's death, just as Henry Plantagenet had been thought the fist behind the death of Thomas Becket. Germany wasn't England. The English may have been most disturbed by Becket's death, but they didn't plot revolt over it, while dissent in the Holy Roman Empire readily boiled up into real civil war. Richard stepped into the soothing role of mediator between the emperor and the church. He didn't act on mere sympathy for a fellow royal. Richard wanted to ensure that Henry would feel no need to go to the French for aid against the German rebels, since that deal might very well include a French dictate that Richard spend the rest of his life in prison. Lionheart did well. Not only did he manage to steady a heated crowd of churchmen and allied barons who were muttering about war, he brought calm to what had been 2 generations of ill feeling between the imperial throne and his brother-in-law, Henry the Lion of Saxony. By this point, the summer of 1193, 6 months into his confinement, the emperor's esteem for Richard had produced a remarkably open-handed incarceration. One might not know it reading a poem Richard wrote for his half-sister, Marie of Champagne, which moans, "Now I know for sure a dead man or a prisoner has no friends or family." The self-pity was far more melodrama than fact. In truth, he enjoyed extensive meetings with delegates from his kingdom, visits from numerous friends, and even the import of his favorite hawks so he could hunt across the emperor's fields. Richard took advantage of contact with his ministers, quickly offering a 6-month truce to his traitor brother John. It wasn't kindness, it was strategy, possibly recommended by their mother, freeing his government to raise cash rather than fight another Plantagenet family feud. The one person he apparently didn't bother to contact was his wife, poor Berengaria. Back home, Richard loyalists were doing their best by their captured king. The Earl of Leicester put down the French attempt on Rouen. Eleanor suppressed a rebellion in the Aquitaine, a local war smudged with Philip Augustus's fingerprints. Philip's mood was increasingly dour. Not only had his efforts at unseating the Plantagenets in Normandy and the Aquitaine gone badly, but his supposed ally, the German emperor, was becoming alarmingly friendly with Lionheart. The emperor wrote boastful letters to Philip, making much of the pleasant congeniality enjoyed between royal jailer and famous captive, even declaring that he wanted to make Richard the King of Provence, an interesting proposal given that Henry had no control of the land in question. Philip genuinely feared that the Germans and the Plantagenets were on the verge of swearing their own pledges, and Henry was perfectly happy to let him think so. Philip certainly had his hands full just now. After 3 years as a widower, he had just married a Danish princess, Ingeborg, apparently in the fond hope he'd gain her father's support for French dreams of an invasion of England. There seemed no reason the lady shouldn't please. She was described as a maiden of great beauty and innocence by a French observer. Be that as it may, a blunt summary of the marriage on day 2 would be utterly disastrous. According to the seemingly bewildered chroniclers, Philip, for unknown reasons, staggered from the royal rooms the morning after his wedding night, pale and trembling, and refused point-blank to go near his new wife again. Loyalists maintained he stumbled into the too little too late discovery that she was a witch. The more modern assessment is that he belatedly came late to the realization that it would have been smarter to marry a German lady, so promptly went out of his way to paint the Danish marriage as an unconsummated nothing. To poor Ingeborg's misfortune, it was a position he'd obstinately stick with for decades to come. Such a blatant insult to the Danes put paid to any visions of Danish cooperation against the English. However, luck never entirely deserted Philip Augustus, and it didn't entirely desert him now. Despite his unhappy experience with the Earl of Leicester at Rouen, Philip had been hard at work along the Norman border. It paid off when the venerable fortress of Gisors, caught between a caged Richard and a very active French army, surrendered to the French. For the Plantagenets, it would have been a tough loss to swallow, but Richard, still under guard in Germany, coped with the news as best he could. He proposed a truce with the French, giving his rival several castles and the promise of 20,000 silver marks, which bought Philip off for a time. But Richard couldn't prevent another round of spectacular treachery from his brother. As 1194 just began to nudge the horizon, the seemingly powerless John Lackland went to Paris and made his own treaty with Philip. Philip had to know John had no authority to do what he did, but he signed the papers with a straight face anyway. Given that John turned over all of Normandy east of Rouen, other smaller territories, and 10 major castles. It was nothing but destructive Plantagenet DNA on full display. A Plantagenet prince willing to gut the Plantagenet Empire if it would smash at a brother for whom he felt equal parts envy and hatred. Lackland didn't even get anything in return except a kiss of peace. The French court must have been in ecstasies. Gisors, castles, 20,000 silver pieces, half of Normandy, and all without lifting a finger. John and Philip would go even further. They knew that the heavily armed ransom convoy, accompanied by Eleanor, anxious to see her boy, was nearing Germany's borders as Christmas of 1193 approached. The emperor, who awaited the treasure with delight, had in turn duly announced that Lionheart would be released on January 17, 1194. Then messengers suddenly arrived in Spire, feet half frozen, clothes sodden from incessant snow. John and Philip had sent them with a truly audacious proposal. The two of them would pay Henry themselves if Henry would hand Richard over to them, or at least agree to keep Richard in Germany for another 8 or 9 months, until the 1194 campaigning season ended. The offer was outrageous, and everyone knew it. But Henry actually saw fit to tell Richard he would not be departing as planned. Henry called for an imperial council at the beginning of February 1194. The debate was described at the time as anxious and difficult, as one might imagine it would be, since the attendees were a mix of pro as well as anti-Richard French, German, and Lackland factions. By the end of the day, Henry decided that taking what amounted to blood money from the French would make him an object of scorn across much of the civilized world, tie him to an anti-Richard alliance he might not really want, and even risk the renewed threat of civil war inside his own borders. The shocking French Lackland offer was rejected. The resulting, we really mean it this time, final agreement as to Richard's ransom, with various sub-terms regarding Sicily and Saxony, was set to parchment. 100,000 silver marks to Henry now, then another 50,000 more to be paid to Leopold later, noble hostages as sureties for the unpaid debt to Leopold, and a conciliatory wedding between Leopold's son and Richard's beautiful niece Eleanor, the fair maid of Brittany. The most startling aspect of the deal was nothing less than Richard's personal homage to Henry. Historian Frank McLynn, among others, says the remarkable idea came from Eleanor, to calm those, like Duke Leopold, who thought Henry too lax with his English friend. England itself would become a fief of the Holy Roman Empire. The arrangement included the promise of another 5,000 English pounds sterling a year to the Germans. The French, in their wildest imagining, couldn't have dreamed such an outcome, while Henry, draped in the riches of a deal he couldn't have anticipated mere days before, sent messages to John and Philip announcing that their nemesis would be free, and demanding that they return everything they had seized from Lionheart during his captivity. And so, at last, Richard was going home. It took him 6 weeks to get there, first carried north by Europe's storied Rhine River, then on into the North Sea. He spent time paying visits to and signing treaties with an array of German princes, an obvious lever against both his new overlord, Henry VI, and Philip Augustus. After additional stops in Brussels and Antwerp, along the French border, Lionheart finally arrived in London after a very public detour to Becket's Canterbury Shrine. The English winter was just beginning to fade as the ransomed king approached London's towered walls. One wonders if he had any fears of a glum welcome from people who had just paid a literal fortune to bring him home. But he needn't have worried. Excited throngs surged through the streets, and bells rang out from London's churches, from St. Andrew's, St. Bride's, St. Dunstan's, St. Giles, and 100 others. It was a grand homecoming, even if historian Geoffrey Reagan thinks much of it was stage-managed. Brother John forgot to make an appearance, but William Marshall skipped his own brother's funeral so he could personally express his pleasure at Richard's return. French spies were so taken with the acclaim Richard enjoyed in the streets that they wrote about it in their dispatches to Paris, while German observers groused that their Henry obviously could have wrung more ransom money from the evidently enthralled English citizenry. Richard may have cost his people a fortune, but they seemed willing to have paid it. As for his former captors, no one could know it at the time, but the spectacular vow of homage that made England a German fief never came to anything. It ended entirely on Henry's deathbed, when he released Richard from the vow. As for Richard's equally spectacular ransom, there's little clarity as to how much was actually paid. Frank McLynn believes Duke Leopold got the worst of it, collecting no more than a fraction, while being excommunicated for imprisoning Richard, a crusader. He then developed gangrene after his horse fell on him. It's said he chopped his own festering leg off with an axe. The alternate story is that his servants did it for him. Whoever did the chopping, it didn't help. The truly unfortunate Duke died anyway. The devout took this as a sign that God frowned on mistreatment of crusaders. Emperor Henry, on the other hand, despite his own excommunication, benefited enormously from the flood of Plantagenet silver paid to the Germans. He was able to afford a sweep across Sicily after Tancred died suddenly in 1194, which ended with Henry's triumphant coronation as King of Sicily. What the devout made of that is unknown. Henry might gloat, but it didn't last long. He died in 1197, and, emperor and king though he was denied burial on church ground. We've come to the end of our story for the time being. I am Beckett Arnold, narrating from the book Lion's Forge, adapted for us by the author Karen Markle-Knapp. Thank you to Francis Butt for voicing our introduction, and so much more. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating, follow our channel, and share us with your friends. Most importantly, please join us again March 10th for the next episode of Lion's Forge, available everywhere you get your favorite podcasts, including on YouTube with video episode trailers. Visit us on Facebook, where you can ask questions, leave reviews, and interact with me. Until next time, thank you for listening.